Opening meditation. There is a sound the mountains make just before dawn. Not quite silence. Something softer than that. A settling. A long exhale, as though the ridges themselves are breathing slowly beneath their covering of hemlock and oak. If you have ever stood in the southern Appalachians at that hour, you will know what I mean. The air holds moisture and wood smoke and something older than either. It holds memory. Tonight, we are going to travel into that memory. Into the green valleys and blue-ridged heights of a world that existed long before maps gave it borders. We are going to follow one man's long, quiet obsession, an obsession that changed the lives of an entire people. And we are going to do so slowly, without hurry, in the way that stories deserve to be told. Let your body settle wherever you are resting. Feel the weight of the blanket, if you have one, lying warm across you. Notice the particular darkness behind your eyelids. There is nothing you need to hold on to tonight. You can let the day's obligations float gently away. The hours ahead are soft ones. You are safe. You are still. And somewhere, in a smoky cabin in the mountains of what is now Tennessee, a man is bent over a piece of bark with a sharpened stick, tracing marks that no one around him can yet understand. Part 1: The World Before the Marks. There is a question that arrives quietly when you think about language long enough. Not with alarm, but with wonder. The question is simply this: what does it feel like to live in a world where your language has never been written down? This was the world of the Cherokee people for thousands of years. And it was not a lesser world for the absence of writing. It was rich beyond measure. It was ancient. It was precise in its own way, carried in memory the way that an old river carries the shape of its bank, every curve worn by long acquaintance, every eddy known by feel. The Cherokee, in the centuries before European contact, lived across an enormous territory. The southern Appalachian Mountains were those rounded, ancient ridges that geologists will tell you are among the oldest mountain formations on Earth, worn down by time until they look almost gentle from a distance, almost soft. But they were not soft places to live. They were steep and wet and full of game, laced with cold streams, covered in forests so dense that sunlight arrived on the forest floor in small coins and patches rather than in floods. Within these towns, culture was transmitted in the old way. Grandmothers held the knowledge of plants, which bark steeped in water would bring down a fever, which root mixed with fat would draw out infection, which combination of smells would ease a grief-sick heart. Clanmothers held genealogical knowledge. The Cherokee were matrilineal, meaning kinship and inheritance passed through the mother's line, and the clans were 7 in number, named for animals and natural things: wolf, deer, bird, paint, long hair, wild potato, blue holly. These identities were not merely social. They determined who you could marry, who bore responsibility for your protection, who grieved for you when you died. The priests and ceremonial leaders held other things. They held the sacred formulas, those intricate and beautiful combinations of words that addressed the spirits of illness, of love, of the hunt, of the river. These formulas were ancient. Some scholars who would later study them after they were finally written down, after the thing we are moving toward had happened, would describe them as some of the most complex and layered oral texts they had ever encountered. They were not simple prayers. They were long, recursive, beautiful structures that required years of learning and precise repetition. And all of it, every piece of this accumulated knowledge, lived only in human memory. Only in the breath of those still living. You can begin to feel, perhaps, the fragility of that arrangement. Not a fragility that the Cherokee themselves had experienced as fragility, because the system had worked for a very long time, had evolved over centuries to be robust and self-reinforcing. Memory communities develop remarkable systems for protecting important knowledge through repetition, through ceremony, through the social structures that ensure certain people are trained as living libraries. But fragility has a way of revealing itself under pressure. And the pressure, by the time we enter this story, was enormous. The 18th century had brought the Cherokee into sustained contact with European settlers and the colonial powers behind them. The Spanish had come from the south, the French from the north and west, the British from the east. Trade had reshaped the economy, deerskins for European goods, the old rhythms of hunting now calibrated to market demand rather than subsistence need. Smallpox and other diseases had struck in successive waves that some estimates suggest killed more than half the Cherokee population in the 1700s alone. Wars had come, the Yamasee War, the Cherokee War of the 1760s, conflicts with neighboring nations, conflicts with colonists, conflicts that required diplomatic navigation of a complexity almost impossible to sustain. And through all of this, the Cherokee had adapted. They were not passive recipients of change. They were active agents, negotiating, adopting, sometimes resisting, always finding ways to remain themselves. But the adoption of certain aspects of the world around them brought its own complications. Some Cherokee families had intermarried with European traders and settlers. Some had converted to Christianity, or at least were in regular contact with Christian missionaries. Some had begun farming in the European style, raising cotton and cattle, building grist mills and ferries. By the end of the 18th century, the Cherokee Nation was in the midst of a profound cultural negotiation, trying to hold on to what was theirs while adapting to a world that seemed to be pressing in from every direction. And one of the things they were watching, with a mixture of curiosity and something not quite envy but something adjacent to it, was the way the surrounding world used paper. Letters arrived and created effects. A piece of paper could travel hundreds of miles and speak on your behalf when you were absent. Laws could be written down and consulted without having to summon the one who had memorized them. Contracts bound the future. Maps drew borders. And the Cherokee, watching all of this, understood something that many people who have writing take entirely for granted, that the ability to set language down in a form that could be retrieved later, by anyone who knew the system, was a form of power unlike any other. This was the world into which Sequoyah was born. A world on the edge of a great transformation, already halfway changed, full of people wondering what would come next and what could be preserved and what would be lost. Part 2: A Man Arrives in the World. Imagine a boy growing up in a Cherokee town in the last decades of the 18th century. The exact year of his birth is uncertain, sometime around 1770 is the best estimate scholars have settled on, though some have argued for dates as early as 1760 or as late as 1776. The uncertainty is itself a reminder of how much of this story existed outside the written record until the written record was created. He was born in Tuskegee, a town near the present-day boundary between Tennessee and North Carolina, in the territory that the Cherokee called their heartland. His mother's name was Werta, a Cherokee woman of the Paint clan. His father is a matter of some historical debate. The most commonly cited account, popularized in the 19th century and repeated in many texts since, names his father as a man of European descent, often identified as Nathaniel Gist, a Virginia trader and the son of Christopher Gist, who had been a companion of George Washington during the French and Indian War. This parentage, if accurate, would make Sequoyah half European by blood. But the meaning of that in Cherokee terms was different from what it might suggest to an outsider. In a matrilineal society, what mattered was your mother's clan. Sequoyah was Paint Clan. He was Cherokee. His father, whoever he was, had likely not been a sustained presence in his life. This was not unusual in the world of the 18th century frontier, where European traders moved through native communities, sometimes forming lasting relationships and sometimes passing through without consequence except to the children they left behind. Some scholars have questioned the Nathaniel Gist story entirely, noting that the identification rests on sources produced long after the fact, shaped by a 19th-century American interest in explaining extraordinary native achievement through European heredity, a deeply problematic impulse that said more about the biases of those doing the explaining than about the reality of the man being explained. Sequoyah's achievement was a Cherokee achievement. Whatever the composition of his blood, he grew up in a Cherokee world, thought in Cherokee, dreamed in Cherokee, and everything he would eventually create, he created in and for Cherokee. His Cherokee name was rendered in English as Sequoyah, though the exact pronunciation in Cherokee is something more like Sequoyah. It may derive from a Cherokee word sometimes translated as pig-foot or lame one, which connects to what we know of his physical condition at some point in his life, perhaps from birth or perhaps from an injury sustained during a hunting accident. Sequoyah had a significant impairment in one leg. He walked with a pronounced limp throughout his adult life. His English name, used in some contexts after contact with Anglo-American communities became more common, was George Gist, or sometimes George Guess. The Gist presumably connected to the putative paternal line. The guess may have been a phonetic approximation by English speakers who heard his name differently. He is known in history most often simply as Sequoyah. His childhood was conventional in many respects: the hunting, the ceremonies, the education passed through example and story that was the Cherokee way of raising children. He showed an early aptitude for craft. He was, by multiple accounts, an exceptionally skilled silversmith as an adult, and also a craftsman in wood and other materials. There is something worth sitting with in this. The man who would invent a writing system spent years as someone who worked with his hands, who translated vision into physical form through the application of careful, patient craft. The syllabary he would eventually create was, in a sense, a craftsman's work, made with the same kind of attention to fit and function that a well-made piece of silver requires. He probably received some exposure to English through the traders and missionaries who moved through Cherokee territory, but by most accounts he never learned to read or write English. This is crucial to the story that follows, and we will return to it. The fact that he created a writing system for a language is remarkable under any circumstances. The fact that he created it without modeling it on a system he himself could use, without being literate in any other language, makes it something else entirely. As a young man, Sequoyah was a hunter and craftsman. He participated in the social and ceremonial life of his community. He married. His first wife's name is sometimes given as Sally or Sarah in English sources, though her Cherokee name is uncertain. He had children. He lived the life of a Cherokee man in a time of accelerating change. The Creek War of 1813 and 1814 brought him into direct contact with the Anglo-American military world. Sequoyah served with Cherokee warriors who fought alongside Andrew Jackson, the same Andrew Jackson who would, a decade and a half later, sign the Indian Removal Act. This bitter irony was not something Sequoyah could have anticipated as he participated in what the United States called a patriotic war. He fought at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in March 1814, that decisive engagement along the Tallapoosa River in what is now Alabama, where Jackson's forces and their Cherokee and Creek allies inflicted a catastrophic defeat on the Red Stick Creek warriors. He came home from that war with something he had not left with. Not a wound, though he may have been present for the extraordinary violence of Horseshoe Bend. What he came home with was a deepened version of an idea that had been forming in his mind for years. Part 3: The Talking Leaves. Before we go further into what Sequoyah did, it is worth sitting with the Cherokee phrase that was used for writing. Talking leaves. Some accounts render it as the talking leaf, referring specifically to a piece of written paper. Others suggest the phrase applied more broadly to the concept of writing itself, marks that spoke. There is a story, possibly apocryphal but widely repeated and worth telling, that early in his thinking about writing, Sequoyah encountered an English letter, possibly a document or a printed page, and showed it to his companions with something like wonder. Someone, a friend, a skeptic, someone who thought he was being credulous about white man's magic, may have told him that the marks were not really speaking, that they were just marks, that some men had agreed on what each mark would mean, and it was no more mysterious than that. Now, Sequoyah did not arrive at this conclusion quickly or cleanly. The process took years, more than a decade, by most accounts. And it passed through several distinct phases, each of which teaches us something about the nature of the problem he was solving. This is, in fact, how some of the oldest writing systems in the world developed. Egyptian hieroglyphics began as picture words. Chinese characters retain a logographic quality, though they are not purely logographic. The earliest Mesopotamian writing was largely logographic, a stylized fish for the word fish, a head for the word head, and so on. It seems intuitive. You see a thing, you draw a rough representation of it, and you have a mark that means the thing. The problem is immediately apparent when you try to scale this approach to an entire language. Cherokee, like all human languages, has thousands and thousands of words. A writing system in which you need to learn a unique symbol for each word requires the memorization of thousands of symbols just to achieve basic literacy. Logographic systems are notoriously difficult to master. The one that comes most readily to modern minds, Chinese, typically requires years of dedicated study before a reader can navigate complex texts with ease. The burden on memory is immense. For a period that some accounts place at around 2 years, Sequoyah worked on his logographic system. He filled bark and later paper with marks, he invented symbols, kept track of them, tried to teach them to his young daughter Ahioka, who was one of his earliest and most important collaborators in this process. But the system was not working. It was growing unwieldy. The number of symbols was expanding rather than resolving into a manageable set. There was no elegant principle at its center. At some point, and this is the intellectual leap that separates Sequoyah's achievement from what others before him had attempted, he realized that the solution was not to represent words but to represent sounds. All human languages, spoken ones, are composed of a finite set of sounds. The sounds combine in patterns to make syllables, and syllables combine to make words. If you could represent each distinct syllable with a single mark, then any word in the language could be written using a small, learnable set of symbols, not thousands, but dozens. The system would be systematic. It would be learnable. It would be, in the deepest sense, a key, not a collection of locked boxes each requiring its own unique mechanism, but a single key that could open all the boxes. This is called a syllabary, a writing system organized around syllables rather than individual sounds, phonemes, as an alphabet is, or around meanings as a logographic system is. Syllabaries have existed in various parts of the world. Japanese kana scripts are syllabaries. The ancient Mycenaean script called Linear B was a syllabary. The Vice syllabary of West Africa, developed in the early 19th century and sometimes cited as a possible influence on Sequoyah, though the evidence is contested, is a syllabary. There is something particularly fitting about the syllable as the unit of writing for a language like Cherokee, which has a phonological structure in which syllables are the most clearly felt rhythmic units of speech. Sequoyah took stock of the sounds in Cherokee. He listened carefully and systematically, and this listening was itself a remarkable intellectual act, the kind of phonological awareness that most people, even highly educated people, do not consciously develop because they have never needed to. To hear your own language as a collection of sound units rather than as a stream of meaning requires a particular kind of abstention from meaning, a focusing on the sound itself rather than what the sound says. He identified the distinct syllable sounds in Cherokee and found that there were approximately 85 of them, though the exact number in his final syllabary ended up being 86. For each of these 86 syllables, he needed a distinct mark. The marks he chose, and here is one of the most fascinating aspects of the entire story, were partly borrowed in shape from English letters and other written materials he had seen, but entirely reassigned in meaning. He had seen English letters. He did not know what they meant in the English system, but he recognized them as marks, as units of a system. He took some of their shapes and gave them entirely new values. The letter R in his syllabary makes a sound utterly unlike the English R. The letter D makes a completely different sound. The shapes were borrowed, the meanings were entirely his own invention. This is important for several reasons. It tells us something about how human cognition encounters written symbols, that the visual form can be separated from the assigned meaning and reassigned without difficulty, given a system that reassigns it consistently. It also tells us something about the nature of invention itself. Rarely does it emerge from nothing. It borrows the materials at hand and reorganizes them in a new pattern. Sequoyah saw the shapes of letters without knowing what they did, and he found uses for them that served his own purposes. Part 4: The Long Years of the Work. The creation of the Cherokee syllabary was not a sudden inspiration. It was a long, slow, sometimes painful process that unfolded across approximately 12 years, from roughly 1809 to 1821. 12 years. The span of a childhood. The span of a war and its aftermath. The span of extraordinary historical events that were reshaping the world in which Sequoyah and the Cherokee lived. To understand what those 12 years felt like from the inside, you have to understand what the surrounding community made of Sequoyah's project. The reactions, by most accounts, ranged from puzzlement to mockery to genuine alarm. His neighbors and community members could not see what he was doing, and what they could not see, they often interpreted through available cultural categories. A man spending enormous amounts of time making strange marks on bark, muttering to himself, neglecting more obviously useful activities, this looked, to some, like something not entirely right. There were suggestions that he had become touched in some way, that the white men's magic had gotten into him, that he was practicing something that had no place in proper Cherokee life. His first wife, and accounts here are not entirely consistent, was apparently not a supporter of the work. One version of the story, repeated frequently though its original sourcing is difficult to verify precisely, holds that she burned his notes. Set fire to the accumulated work of years, the bark sheets and whatever paper he had filled with his developing marks. The details of this episode vary across sources, and some historians have questioned how literally it should be taken, but the general shape of the story, that his household was not a refuge for the work, that the project created domestic conflict, is consistent with multiple accounts. If the burning happened, consider what it meant. Years of work, consumed. Marks that existed nowhere else in the world, because Sequoyah had not yet taught the system to anyone who could reconstruct it, gone in a matter of minutes. The smell of smoke, and silence. A lesser obsession would have ended there. Many people have had their life's work destroyed and not rebuilt it. There is a particular quality of grief in losing something that no one else can replace, because no one else knows it existed in the form that you had given it. But Sequoyah rebuilt. He started again from the beginning, or perhaps from a point some way along, since at least some of what he had worked out lived in his own memory. And this time, or so the account suggests, he was more careful, more methodical, more resolved. His young daughter Ahioka was, throughout this period, his most consistent companion in the work. She was perhaps 6 or 7 when he began actively teaching her the syllabary as it developed, and her ability to learn it and use it served both as proof of concept. If a child could master it, it was teachable, and as practical assistance. She became his first student, his first reader. She could look at the marks and hear Cherokee, and she could hear Cherokee and make the marks. The loop was complete. There is something deeply moving about this image, a father and daughter, alone in their conviction that what they were doing mattered, while the community around them remained skeptical or worse. The intimacy of shared obsession. The way that Ahioka's willingness to learn must have sustained Sequoyah through periods when no one else believed in him. By around 1817 or 1818, Sequoyah had moved west, to Arkansas, where a portion of the Cherokee had already relocated under pressure from the U.S. government. The Cherokee were being divided. Those who had moved west were sometimes called the Old Settler or Western Cherokee, and those who remained in the East, in the original homelands of Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, and North Carolina, were the main body of the nation. This geographic division was a wound in itself, a tearing of the community that would only deepen in the years to come. Sequoyah carried the syllabary with him through this move. He continued to refine it in Arkansas, to test it, to teach it carefully to a small number of trusted people. He was moving, slowly and deliberately, toward the moment of demonstration, toward the proof that would need to be offered if the system was ever going to become what he believed it could become. Around 1821, he judged the system complete. 86 symbols. One for each distinct syllable in Cherokee. A logical, learnable, consistent key to the sound of the language. The question now was how to introduce it. How to take something that existed between him and his daughter and perhaps a few others and open it to the world. The story of that demonstration is one of the most remarkable scenes in the history of writing. Part 5: The Demonstration. The year was 1821. The place was the Cherokee heartland in the East, specifically, in the context of one of the Cherokee councils, those deliberative gatherings where the leadership and elders of the nation came together to conduct the business of the community. The exact council and location are described differently in different sources, but the general scene is consistent. Sequoyah appeared before Cherokee leaders and proposed to show them something. Think about the difficulty of this moment. He had spent more than a decade on a project that his community had largely regarded with skepticism. He had not been a council leader or a prominent figure in the formal political structure of the Cherokee Nation. He was a craftsman, a silversmith, a man with a limp and an idea that made people uncomfortable. And now he was asking the assembled elders and leaders to watch while he demonstrated something they had, for the most part, never seen or imagined. The demonstration he devised was elegant in its simplicity. He sent his daughter Ahioka, who was by this point perhaps in her early teens, out of earshot, far enough away that she genuinely could not hear what was being said. Then he invited the assembled council members to speak something to him. Any message. Any combination of words they chose. He would write it down in his marks. When Ahioka was called back, she was given the marks he had made. She read aloud what her father had written. And what she read was exactly what had been said. Exactly. Word for word. Consider what this must have felt like for those present. These were people who understood the concept of memory. They had trained memories. They lived in a culture that placed enormous value on the precise retention of spoken words. They knew what it meant to hear something once and be responsible for holding it. And here was a system that required no such responsibility, that did the holding itself, perfectly, indefinitely, without the fragility of human memory. The council's response, by the accounts that have come down to us, was somewhere between wonder and cautious acceptance. There was not, by the descriptions we have, an immediate and ecstatic embrace. The Cherokee were careful deliberators. They took time with important decisions. But there was recognition. There was the unmistakable sense that something significant had just occurred. What happened in the weeks and months after the demonstration was, in its own way, as remarkable as the demonstration itself. The syllabary began to spread. People began to learn it. And here is the thing that astonished observers, both Cherokee and non-Cherokee: people learned it quickly. Extraordinarily quickly. Adults who had never engaged with any writing system sat down with the syllabary and could read and write in it within days, sometimes, according to some accounts, within a single day of intensive practice. This speed of acquisition is not an exaggeration or a myth. It is a documented feature of the syllabary that has attracted considerable scholarly attention. The reason for it is actually quite clear once it is explained, though it is counterintuitive to those of us who learn to read through the slow, grinding process of phonics instruction or similar methods. An alphabet represents phonemes, individual sounds like the P in pin or the short I in sit. The number of phonemes in a language is relatively small. English has around 44, but the relationship between letters and sounds in an alphabetic system is often far from simple. English spelling, famously, does not reliably predict pronunciation. A child learning to read English must contend with enormous irregularity, the oof and through and though and thought and tough all representing different sounds, for instance. The Cherokee syllabary was different in two key ways. First, it mapped onto syllables, which are larger and more psychologically salient units of speech than individual phonemes. When Cherokees learned the syllabary, they were learning marks for sound units they already perceived and used naturally in speaking. The learning felt like recognition rather than construction. The result was that literacy spread through the Cherokee Nation with a speed that had no precedent in any colonized people's experience of acquiring writing. Accounts from the 1820s describe entire towns learning the syllabary within weeks. Letters began to pass between eastern and western Cherokee communities. Families separated by the move to Arkansas could now write to each other. Messages that had previously required a human messenger, who would carry the spoken words in memory, could now be placed on paper and sent. Part 6: The Nation Reads Itself. By 1825, something unprecedented was happening in the Cherokee Nation. A substantial portion of the adult Cherokee population, estimates vary, but contemporary observers suggested it was a very significant fraction, had become literate in their own language. In Cherokee. Not in English. Not in any European tongue. In the language of their grandmothers, written in marks that no European had devised. The implications were vast and they were felt immediately. The Cherokee had been engaged, for decades, in difficult negotiations with the United States government over their land and sovereignty. These negotiations were conducted largely in English, largely through intermediaries, largely in contexts where the Cherokee were at a significant informational disadvantage, where treaties could be read to them but they could not independently verify the reading, where documents could be altered after agreement, where the written record was controlled entirely by one side. Literacy in Cherokee did not immediately resolve these structural disadvantages. But it changed something about the internal capacity of the nation to conduct its own business. Laws could be written down. Council decisions could be recorded. History could be fixed in a form that did not depend on the survival of particular memory keepers. The Cherokee Nation's leaders, watching the syllabary spread and comprehending what it made possible, moved with real deliberateness to institutionalize it. In 1827, the Cherokee Nation adopted a written constitution modeled, in broad structure, on the United States Constitution, which was itself only 4 decades old. It established 3 branches of government, a principal chief, a national council, and courts. It defined citizenship. It claimed the sovereignty of the Cherokee people over their lands. And then, in 1828, the thing happened that can stand as a symbol of everything the syllabary made possible. The Cherokee Phoenix began publication. The Cherokee Phoenix was a newspaper, the first Native American newspaper in history. It was published in the Cherokee capital of New Dakota, in what is now northwest Georgia. Its name in Cherokee was Tsalagiite Sulahisanuni, roughly, the Cherokee Messenger. Its editor was Elias Bodino, a young, educated Cherokee man who had been born as Buck Waddy and had taken the name of a prominent American politician who had sponsored his education. The content of the Cherokee Phoenix was remarkable in its range and seriousness. It published news from the surrounding American states and world. It published Cherokee laws and council proceedings. It published letters from readers. It published arguments about land rights and sovereignty. It published Christian religious content. Many of its supporters, including Bodino, were Christian converts. It published information about agriculture and practical matters. And it published in both languages, sometimes the same text in both, sometimes different content in each. The paper was read within the Cherokee Nation and also attracted attention far beyond it. Copies made their way to newspapers in the eastern United States, where the existence of a Cherokee language press was reported with a mixture of genuine wonder and, in some cases, the kind of patronizing surprise that tells us as much about the expectations of the observers as about the achievement of the people being observed. Missionary societies took note. The American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, which had been working among the Cherokee for years and which ran schools in Cherokee territory, adapted its materials to use the syllabary. Within a few years, portions of the Bible were being printed in Cherokee. Religious tracts, instructional materials, medical guides, a growing body of written material in Cherokee was accumulating, a corpus that had not existed even a decade before. Sequoyah himself, during this period, was living in the West, in Arkansas. He had not remained in the East to watch the syllabary spread, or to oversee its adoption and institutionalization. He had returned to his life there, his craft, his family, his community. He received honors. The Cherokee Nation awarded him a silver medal. There is a particular appropriateness in this, given his life work as a silversmith, and a small annuity as recognition of what he had given them. Visitors came to see him. His name became known far beyond the Cherokee Nation. But what he thought about it all, what it felt like from the inside to watch the thing he had spent 12 years building become the living practice of an entire people, that, mostly, he did not say. Or if he said it, the words were not preserved. The man whose gift was the preservation of words left few words about himself. Part 7, The Shadow of Removal. While the syllabary spread and the Cherokee Phoenix printed its bilingual pages and the nation wrote itself into a new kind of existence, a shadow was moving across the hills of Georgia and Tennessee. A shadow that had been present for a long time, that had shape and direction, that was moving with a terrible and particular inevitability. The question of Cherokee land, specifically, the land in the southeastern United States that the Cherokee had occupied for centuries, had been contested for decades by the time the syllabary appeared. Georgia, in particular, had been agitating for the removal of the Cherokee from its borders since before the Revolution was fully resolved. The state's political leaders argued that the presence of the Cherokee Nation within Georgia's geographic boundaries was incompatible with state sovereignty, with the legal framework of land ownership, with the economic development they envisioned for the region. When Andrew Jackson was elected to the presidency in 1828, the same year the Cherokee Phoenix began publication, the balance shifted decisively. Jackson was not a subtle man on the subject of native peoples. He believed, with the confidence of someone who had spent his military career fighting them, that the removal of native nations from the eastern states was both inevitable and desirable. He had no patience for the legal arguments that the Cherokee and their allies were assembling. He had no sympathy for the idea that a native nation might have rights that the United States government was bound to respect. The Indian Removal Act was signed into law on May 28, 1830. It authorized the president to negotiate treaties exchanging native peoples' eastern lands for territory west of the Mississippi. Negotiate is a word that carried enormous ambiguity in this context, as events would demonstrate. Marshall's decision held that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct political community with the right to self-government, that the laws of Georgia had no force within Cherokee territory, and that the relationship between the Cherokee and the United States was governed by federal treaties and federal law, not state legislation. It was, on paper, a complete legal victory for the Cherokee. Andrew Jackson did not enforce it. The most commonly cited summary of his response, whether or not the exact words were spoken in precisely this form, captures his attitude: Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. The federal executive would not act to protect the Cherokee from Georgia's encroachments. The decision sat on the books, a piece of law with no force behind it. The years between Worcester versus Georgia and the eventual removal were years of increasing pressure, violence, and despair. Georgia allowed a lottery to distribute Cherokee lands to white settlers. Gold had been discovered in Cherokee territory in 1829, the first gold rush in American history, a fact rarely foregrounded in accounts that focus more heavily on California in 1849, and the discovery enormously intensified the pressure for removal, bringing thousands of white prospectors into Cherokee territory without any legal right to be there. Within the Cherokee Nation, the question of whether to accept a negotiated removal treaty or to continue resisting divided the community bitterly. there emerged two broad factions. The National Party, led by Principal Chief John Ross, held firm that removal was unacceptable, that the land was theirs by every legal and moral standard, that resistance must continue. The Treaty Party, whose most prominent figures included Elias Boudinot, the editor of the Cherokee Phoenix, and Major Ridge and his son John Ridge, argued, with real anguish, that removal was coming regardless, that the only question was whether it would be negotiated on terms that offered some protection or imposed in conditions of complete helplessness. The Treaty of New Echota was signed in December 1835 by members of the Treaty Party, a small group of approximately 300 Cherokee who had gathered without authorization from the nation's principal chief or its national council. They signed away all Cherokee lands east of the Mississippi in exchange for land in the West and various payments. John Ross and the National Party, representing the overwhelming majority of the Cherokee people, immediately protested that the treaty was fraudulent, that it had no legitimate authority, that it had not been approved by the Cherokee government. The United States Senate ratified the treaty anyway, by a single vote, in 1836. The deadline for removal was set for May 1838. What followed, in the summer and fall and winter of 1838 and 1839, is known in Cherokee history as Nunadulsuni, the trail where they cried. It is known in American history as the Trail of Tears. The removal was carried out by U.S. Army troops and state militias. The Cherokee were rounded up from their homes, often at gunpoint, sometimes with little or no warning, and held in stockades while preparations were made for the westward march. Their homes were looted and burned, sometimes before they had fully left them. Their farms and orchards and cattle were taken over by the settlers who immediately moved in behind the military columns. The march itself, conducted in the brutal cold of late 1838 into early 1839, covered approximately 1,000 miles. The Cherokee were inadequately supplied. Disease spread in the camps and along the route. People died of cold, hunger, dysentery, measles, pneumonia. They died of grief. Estimates of the total death toll vary, but historians generally accept that somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 Cherokee died as a direct result of the removal out of a total population of perhaps 16,000. Perhaps a quarter of the nation, or more. But the syllabary itself was not silenced. People carried it in their memories and in the letters in their pockets. The marks survived the march. The sounds survived. The language survived, written into the air and scratched onto whatever surface was at hand, all the way to the west, all the way to what is now Oklahoma, where the survivors arrived depleted and grieving and carrying, along with everything else they had managed not to lose, the ability to read and write in their own language. Part 8, Sequoyah in the West. By the time of the Trail of Tears, Sequoyah was already living in what is now Oklahoma. He had been part of the earlier migration, the voluntary removal of some western Cherokee communities in the years before the forced march. He was in his 60s or perhaps his early 70s, old by the standards of his era and his world. His leg made travel increasingly difficult. He had established a salt works near his home, a practical enterprise that provided both an income and a product of genuine utility. The arrival of the Eastern Cherokee in 1839 brought together the two branches of the nation in a new and fragile proximity. The years immediately following were not peaceful. The bitterness over the Treaty of New Echota had not dissipated. In June 1839, John Ridge, Major Ridge, and Elias Boudinot, three of the principal signers of the treaty, were killed by members of the National Party faction in coordinated attacks. Major Ridge was shot from his horse on a road in Arkansas. John Ridge was dragged from his bed and stabbed in front of his family. Bodino was lured from his home with a story about needing medicine and killed by the men who had accompanied him. The Syllabary, during these turbulent years, continued its quiet work. The act of writing and reading in Cherokee was, among other things, an act of continuity, a practice that said we are still here, we are still ourselves, our language is still alive and can be preserved. In a time of profound disruption, the ability to write in Cherokee was a thread of connection, not only between people but between the people and their own identity. Sequoyah in his later years was visited, written about, and honored in ways that were sometimes comfortable and sometimes less so. He was examined by American scholars and officials who were trying to understand what he had done. He was praised in terms that sometimes felt like they were reaching for the frame of a European genius, the way American and European commentators often needed a European analog to comprehend a native achievement. He was compared to Cadmus, the mythological Phoenician who was credited by the Greeks with bringing the alphabet to Greece. The comparison is not without aptness, though it carries the weight of a culture that can only understand new things through old references. He gave interviews, or something like interviews, conversations with literate visitors who then wrote down what he said in their own words, which introduces layers of translation and interpretation. One of the fullest accounts of his own description of the Syllabary comes from a conversation with a man named John Howard Payne, who visited him around 1835. Payne's account, though filtered through his own sensibility and rendered in the somewhat inflated style of his time, preserves what appears to be a genuine description of the process, the years of work, the phases of the system's development, the burning of the notes, the eventual completion. Sequoyah also, in his later years, pursued a project that has remained tantalizing and incompletely understood. He became interested in finding the connection, if there was one, between the Western Cherokee and groups of native people who had, in some accounts, separated from the main Cherokee body centuries earlier and moved toward Mexico. This was a traditional belief, a story within Cherokee oral history, and Sequoyah, the man who had spent his life making written connection possible, wanted to test the story, to find these people if they existed, to extend the reach of connection. Around 1842, at an age when many people are long past any impulse toward physical adventure, Sequoyah joined a small party heading into Mexico on this quest. The details of what followed are murky. The party did travel, by most accounts. They may have encountered people they believed to be connected to the Cherokee. What they found, or didn't find, and what ultimately happened remains genuinely uncertain. What is certain is that Sequoyah did not return. He died in Mexico, or somewhere in the borderlands, sometime around 1843, the exact date and place unknown, the circumstances unclear. He was buried there, far from the mountains of his birth, in a grave that has never been definitively located. The man who gave his people a way to write their own language died without anyone writing down where he lay. There is something in that silence that feels like the story completing a circle. He had always been more interested in the work than in the record. The Syllabary was the monument. The man could rest unnamed. Part 9, The Nature of the Gift. Let us stay with the Syllabary itself for a while. Its structure, its beauty, the particular genius of its design, because there is something worth examining slowly here, something that rewards careful attention. The 86 characters of the Cherokee Syllabary are arranged in a table that Sequoyah himself composed. The arrangement is logical, the columns are organized by the consonant sound that begins each syllable, and the rows are organized by the vowel sound that ends each syllable. Cherokee has 6 vowel sounds, A, E, I, O, U, and a sixth that is sometimes described as a short or obscure vowel, rendered in various transcription systems with different symbols but present as a distinct phoneme in the language. So when you look at the syllabary chart, you see a grid. Across the top, the different consonant sounds. Down the side, the different vowel sounds. Each cell of the grid holds the character for the syllable formed by that consonant and that vowel. The result is visually orderly, almost architectural. You can feel the systematic mind that organized it. Some of the characters are strikingly simple: a single curved line, a circle, a cross. Others are more complex, multi-stroke forms that require several movements of the hand to draw. The overall visual impression is unlike any other writing system in the world. It does not look like an alphabet. It does not look like Chinese characters. It does not look like cuneiform. It looks like Cherokee, which is to say it looks like itself, a thing without a precise precedent. The characters that were borrowed in shape from English or possibly from other printed materials like newspapers or almanacs that Sequoyah had encountered have always attracted scholarly interest. Several of the syllabary characters clearly resemble English letters. There is a character that looks like R, one that looks like D, one like W, one like G, one like A. But none of them represent the same sound as the English letter they resemble. The Cherokee R-shaped character represents the syllable pronounced roughly like SA. The D-shaped character represents A. The resemblances are visual only. This tells us something interesting about how Sequoyah approached the task of symbol design. He had a set of visual forms available to him, the shapes he had seen in print and in handwriting, and he used them the way an artist might use found objects, as raw material, interesting for their visual properties, available for repurposing. The fact that English speakers would look at his syllabary and see familiar letter shapes attached to completely unexpected sounds suggests the degree to which Sequoyah was operating outside the English system entirely, using its visual vocabulary without being bound by its phonological assignments. What the syllabary does not have, and what is worth noting for what it tells us about the nature of language, is any representation of tone. Cherokee is a tonal language. The same syllable spoken with a different pitch pattern can mean something entirely different. Sequoyah's syllabary, as originally designed, does not represent tone. This is not an oversight. Exactly, tone in Cherokee, while real and phonemically meaningful, is often inferable from context, and the syllabary was designed as a practical communication tool rather than a complete phonological transcription system. But it is a feature of the system that Cherokee linguists and language teachers have worked with and around in the modern era, developing additional notation for tone where needed. The syllabary has also been praised for the way it fits the phonological structure of Cherokee with a kind of naturalness that suggests deep knowledge of the language. Cherokee words are, for the most part, syllable-timed. The syllable is the fundamental rhythmic and phonological unit. The syllabary works with this feature rather than against it. A speaker of Cherokee, moving through the syllabary, moves through it in units that correspond to the felt structure of speech. For comparison, consider how an alphabetic writing system like English requires the reader to reconstruct syllable structure from individual letter-sound correspondences, which can be deeply counterintuitive. Children learning to read in English are being asked to do something cognitively complex, to take units smaller than they naturally perceive, individual phonemes, and assemble them into the larger units, syllables, words, that they actually process when they listen. The syllabary asks for nothing like this. It asks only, what sound does this mark make? And the answer is always a complete, natural syllabic unit. There is also something worth saying about what the syllabary meant for the sacred texts, those formulas, those ceremonial incantations that had been held only in the memories of specialists. Once the syllabary existed, some of these texts were written down. Hundreds of them were eventually recorded, in what scholars now call the formula manuscripts, notebooks and folded pages, written in syllabary by the priests and healers who held them, sometimes decorated with small drawings, sometimes written in a hand so personal and idiosyncratic as to be nearly illegible to other readers. These manuscripts were eventually collected, beginning in the late 19th century, by the ethnographer James Mooney, who spent years in Cherokee communities and acquired hundreds of formula texts, some through purchase, some as gifts from practitioners who believed their knowledge should be preserved. Mooney's collection is now held at the Smithsonian Institution, where it represents one of the most significant bodies of indigenous ceremonial literature in the world. Without the syllabary, this literature would not have been written. Without Sequoyah's 12 years of patient work, the formulas, those intricate, ancient, precise structures that address the spirits of sickness and healing in love and war, would have continued their existence in memory alone, vulnerable to the terrible losses that had already begun and were about to intensify. The syllabary saved them. Not perfectly, not completely, some knowledge was still lost in the disruptions of removal and the pressures of the following decades. But far more survived than would have survived without the marks. The talking leaves spoke even when the people who had held the words in memory were gone. Part 10, Echoes, Airs, and the Living Language. The story does not end with Sequoyah's death in 1843, or with the Trail of Tears, or with the period of chaos and grief that followed the forced removal. The syllabary continued. The language continued. And the story of what the syllabary became in the generations after its creation is as worth telling as the story of its creation. In the years following the reunification of the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma, the syllabary became a central feature of Cherokee public and private life. Schools were established in the new Cherokee Nation west of the Mississippi, including what would become known as the Cherokee National Male Seminary and the Cherokee National Female Seminary, both established in 1851. These were remarkable institutions of higher education for Cherokee citizens, modeled broadly on collegiate academies of the eastern United States, but serving a Cherokee student body and operating in a context where the syllabary was a tool of daily communication. By the 1880s, the Cherokee Nation had one of the highest literacy rates of any population in North America. This is a striking claim, and it deserves to be held for a moment. A people who had been violently displaced, who had lost thousands of their members in a forced march, who were living on lands they had been compelled to accept in place of their ancestral home, these people had, through the syllabary and the institutions they built around it, created a literate community whose educational achievements were genuinely comparable to or exceeding those of the surrounding Anglo-American population. The Cherokee Advocate, a newspaper that followed and in some respects continued the tradition of the Cherokee Phoenix, was publishing bilingual content throughout the latter half of the 19th century. It covered not only Cherokee national news but also world events, agricultural information, legal notices, and letters from citizens. The Cherokee syllabary was in regular, practical, daily use, in commerce, in law, in correspondence, in the recording of history and ceremony. The statehood of Oklahoma in 1907 brought new pressures. The Dawes Act of 1887 and subsequent legislation had been systematically dismantling tribal governments and communal landholding arrangements across Indian Territory. The Cherokee Nation's governmental structures were effectively dissolved as Oklahoma became a state. The institutions, the seminaries, the courts, the newspaper, were either discontinued or absorbed into the new state structure. The period from roughly 1907 into the mid-20th century was a period of contraction for the Cherokee language and the syllabary both. Federal education policy actively suppressed native languages in boarding schools, where Cherokee children were punished for speaking their language and forbidden to use the syllabary. The generation that came of age in these schools was often left with damaged relationships to their language, not the clean severance of knowing nothing, but the more painful half-knowing of people who had been taught that what they knew was shameful. By the 1970s, when a new era of native political and cultural assertion was beginning, energized by the American Indian movement and the shifting political climate that produced the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975, the Cherokee language was in a precarious position. The number of fluent speakers had dropped dramatically. Many of the remaining fluent speakers were elderly. The Cherokee Nation, reorganized as a sovereign governmental entity with elected leadership and a formal governmental structure, made the preservation and revitalization of the language and the syllabary a priority. Language programs were developed. Immersion schools were established. Materials were created: books, recordings, software, eventually digital fonts and keyboard systems, to make the syllabary accessible to people learning it in the modern context. In 2010, the Unicode Consortium, the international body that maintains the standards for text encoding used by virtually every computer and digital device in the world, significantly expanded the Cherokee block in the Unicode standard. The characters of the syllabary were encoded in ways that allowed them to be typed, displayed, and transmitted digitally. Every character of Sequoyah's invention was given its own numerical code in the global system that underlies all digital text. Today, you can type in Cherokee. You can send a text message in Cherokee. You can create a website in Cherokee. You can use social media, read Wikipedia articles, navigate digital interfaces in the syllabary. The marks that Sequoyah traced on bark in a smoky cabin in Tennessee are now embedded in the deepest structures of the global information system. The Cherokee Nation website uses the syllabary. Elementary schools in Oklahoma teach children to write in Sequoyah's characters. Young people are making music and art and social media content in Cherokee. There is a generation growing up with the syllabary as a living practice rather than a heritage artifact, children for whom the marks are not history but present tense. None of this is without difficulty. Language revitalization is hard work, slow work, work that requires sustained institutional commitment and community will and individual sacrifice. The number of fully fluent Cherokee speakers, those for whom the language is the first and primary language of thought, remains relatively small, though efforts to increase it are ongoing and earnest. The syllabary's existence does not by itself ensure the language's survival. But it is an extraordinary resource. It means that Cherokee can be written down and preserved in a form that any Cherokee person can learn to read, relatively quickly, without mastering a foreign script. The syllabary is also, in a real sense, a statement. It says, this language is worth writing. It says, this language has its own marks, marks that belong to it, marks that were made for it by one of its own speakers. Every piece of Cherokee text written in the syllabary carries, in the very choice of those characters, an assertion of cultural continuity and self-determination that is not present in Cherokee text written in the Roman alphabet. The form is part of the meaning. In 2004, a new serif typeface for the syllabary was designed by a team working in conjunction with the Cherokee Nation. Called Plantagenet Cherokee, It brought the characters into a typographic tradition usually associated with European scripts: the serif, the weighted stroke, the proportioned letterform of professional typography. The characters of Sequoyah's invention sat in the grid alongside Roman letters, clean and legible, as settled in their forms as any letter that has been in use for centuries. Because they have been. They are nearly 2 centuries old now. They were settled by Sequoyah with such precision that virtually no modifications have been needed. The system he invented, working alone with a sharpened stick and bark in the mountains, without formal training in linguistics or typography or the history of writing systems, that system is still in use, substantially unchanged, still doing exactly what he designed it to do. It is fitting, perhaps, that the tallest tree in the world bears his name. In 1847, 4 years after Sequoyah's death, the botanist Stephen Endlicher named the giant sequoia of California Sequoiadendron giganteum in honor of the Cherokee scholar. The etymology is debated and the connection is primarily honorific rather than scientifically rigorous. But the image holds something true: a tree that is enormous, ancient by the standards of individual things, and yet alive, still growing, its roots deep and its canopy still reaching. Part 11: The Man and the Mystery. There is a particular quality to the historical figures we know primarily through their work. We know what they made. We know the contours of what they did. But the inner texture of who they were, the color of their silences, the specific weight of what made them laugh, the precise quality of their grief that dissolves into the gap between the living moment and the written record. From these fragmentary sources, a human being assembles itself, imperfectly but with genuine presence. He was described as patient. Not passive. There is an important difference. Active patience, the kind that works on something for 12 years without abandoning it, is a particular quality of character that shows up in certain kinds of people and in almost no one else. He was apparently willing to endure being laughed at, which requires a kind of deep inner certainty or a deep detachment from external validation, or perhaps both. He was described as gentle in manner but firm in conviction. People who met him in his later years, when he was already a figure of some renown, seem to have found him approachable and unhurried, the same quality that characterized his work. He spoke with care. He was interested in other people's ideas and in the question of how different peoples had developed different ways of doing similar things. The question of his spiritual beliefs is interesting and not fully resolvable. He was not, apparently, a Christian convert in a time when many Cherokee, including some of his most prominent contemporaries, had adopted Christianity. He seems to have remained more closely connected to traditional Cherokee spiritual practices and worldview. The formulas, the ceremonial knowledge, the traditional understandings of the relationship between language and spiritual power, these were not foreign to him. He grew up in a world where words were understood to do things, not merely to describe things, where the right words spoken in the right way at the right moment had genuine effects in the world. There is something interesting in the relationship between this worldview and the syllabary. In traditional Cherokee understanding, language had power. The formulas worked, when spoken correctly, because the words themselves carried force. If you believe that, then giving those words a written form is not merely a practical convenience. It is also a way of extending their power, of making them available in new forms and contexts, of preserving the force of language against the depredations of time and forgetting. The syllabary, from this angle, was not just a technology. It was a ceremonial act. His second marriage, in the West, was to a woman named Sally, a common English name given to Cherokee women in this period, though her Cherokee name may have been different. He had children. He had a household, a salt works, a life embedded in community. He was not only an intellectual, he was a man who built things with his hands, who maintained relationships, who participated in the practical, embodied life of his people. The journey to Mexico in his old age, that last, long search for the lost Cherokees of the tradition, has an almost mythological quality that makes it difficult to assess clearly. Was it a practical ethnographic expedition? Was it an old man's dream? Was it driven by genuine evidence of a surviving Cherokee-related community in Mexico, or by the kind of story that becomes more compelling as age makes one more aware of what has been lost? The truth is probably a mixture. There are accounts, contested but not entirely dismissible, of Cherokee-speaking or Cherokee-related communities in the regions he was heading toward, and Sequoyah had good reasons to take the tradition seriously. But he did not return. Whatever he found or didn't find in the mountains of northern Mexico or the borderlands beyond, he remained there. The place is sometimes described as somewhere near Tamaulipas or near San Fernando, in later accounts deeply imprecise geographic claims for a man whose final location was never reliably established. Attempts have been made, over the years, to find his grave. None have been definitively successful. There are sites in Mexico that have been identified as possible burial locations, and there have been ceremonial acknowledges and markers placed. But the man himself, the body of the man who made the marks, remains, in a very real sense, lost. The landscape has not given him back. What remains of him in the material world is the metal. There are replicas, and there are accounts of the original silver medal given him by the Cherokee Nation, though its current location is uncertain. What remains is his portrait, painted in 1828 by Charles Bird King, and reproduced widely in subsequent decades, the image of a man in middle or later age, wearing a turban in the Creek style that was fashionable in some Cherokee circles, holding a piece of paper on which some of the syllabary characters are visible. He is looking directly at the viewer. His expression is calm and considered. He looks like someone who has thought about things for a long time and is comfortable with what he has arrived at. Part 12, The Gift and the Question It Leaves. Every great human achievement arrives in the world trailing questions. Not doubts about whether the achievement is real, but deeper questions about what it means, about what it changes, about what it cannot change by itself. Sequoiah's syllabary is real. Its achievements are documented and are not in serious dispute. The speed of Cherokee literacy acquisition in the 1820s is documented in missionary records and contemporary accounts from multiple sources. The Cherokee phoenix is a physical object that can be held and read. The formula manuscripts exist in archives. The Syllabary's current use in Part 12, continued the gift and the question it leaves. The Syllabary's current use in schools, in digital platforms, in the daily life of the Cherokee Nation is observable and documented. The achievement is not a legend or a myth. It is a real thing that happened. But the questions it leaves behind are real too, and they deserve to be turned over slowly in the quiet of this late hour. The first question is about what writing systems do to the languages they encode. This is not a simple question, and linguists and anthropologists have been working on it for more than a century without arriving at a clean answer. There is a school of thought associated most prominently with certain interpretations of the work of Walter Ong and Eric Havelock that argues writing fundamentally changes the nature of language and thought. That literate cultures think differently from oral cultures, not merely more efficiently but in qualitatively different ways. That writing separates the word from the speaker, creates a kind of abstract relationship with language that was not possible before, changes what can be said and how it can be said and even what can be thought. There is another school of thought that resists this strong version of the claim, arguing that writing is a tool that language communities use, that it serves the community rather than reshaping it at the deepest level, that oral traditions and literate practices can coexist without the literate inevitably erasing the oral. The second question is about the relationship between writing and power. The syllabary was created, in significant part, in response to an awareness that the surrounding world used writing as an instrument of power, that treaties written down in English could bind the Cherokee to things they had not clearly agreed to, that laws written in English and enforced by courts operating in English were not accessible to Cherokee speakers who could not read English, that the absence of a writing system placed the Cherokee at a structural disadvantage in every formal interaction with the United States government. The syllabary addressed this. It gave the Cherokee the ability to create their own written record, their own documented assertions of rights and laws in history. But it could not, by itself, address the underlying power imbalance. The courts that would adjudicate Cherokee rights operated in English. The federal government that would decide the question of removal operated in English. The political culture that would ultimately determine the fate of Cherokee land and sovereignty was conducted entirely in English. The syllabary was a profound internal resource. It was not a sufficient protection against external force. This is not a criticism of Sequoyah or the syllabary. It is simply a recognition of what writing can and cannot do. Writing can preserve. Writing can connect. Writing can assert and record and demonstrate. Writing cannot, by itself, compel the powerful to respect what it has preserved and connected and asserted and recorded. That requires other things: political coalitions, legal processes, moral persuasion, the slow grinding of history towards something better. The Trail of Tears happened despite the syllabary. It happened despite the written Constitution, despite the Cherokee Phoenix, despite Worcester versus Georgia, despite every instrument of written argument and legal assertion that the Cherokee had marshaled. It happened because the power to remove was held by people who chose to use it, and no amount of writing could change that choice in the short term. What the syllabary could do, and did do, was ensure that the Cherokee who survived arrived in the West with their language intact in written form, that the knowledge of the syllabary traveled with the people rather than being left behind with the land, that the capacity for internal communication and cultural preservation survived even as the external conditions of life were completely overturned. The third question, perhaps the most resonant for this late hour, is about what it means to create something that outlasts you. To make a thing that goes on existing and doing work long after you are gone. Sequoyah knew, in his later years, that the syllabary had become something larger than him. He had already been celebrated as its creator, already received honors, already watched it spread through the nation in ways that he could observe but not fully control or direct. The syllabary was no longer his. It was the nation's. He was its origin point but not its owner. The marks lived in other hands now, in other minds, on other pages. Whether Sequoyah felt that peace, or whether he felt something else, anxiety about whether the syllabary would survive the turbulent years he lived through, grief at watching his people suffer, something more complex and mixed than peace, we do not know. We cannot know. The inner life of the man is mostly closed to us. But we can observe the outcomes. We can see that the syllabary did survive. That it survived removal, and the dissolution of the tribal governments, and the boarding school era, and the long pressure of assimilation. That it survived into a digital world its creator could not have imagined and is now encoded in the same standard that encodes every emoji, every Arabic letter, every Mandarin character, every piece of written text that travels through the global network. That it is being taught to children who are growing up in a world where the Cherokee language is under pressure but present, where grandparents speak it and grandchildren are learning it, where the circle of transmission is strained but not broken. The syllabary exists. The language exists. And somewhere in the mountains of what is now Tennessee and Georgia and North Carolina, the ancient, rounded mountains that are among the oldest on earth, the hemlock-covered ridges, the cold streams, there are people who know both. Who can walk in those mountains and hear the names of the hills in Cherokee and know how to write those names in the marks that belong to them? Closing meditation. You have traveled a long way tonight. Through mountains older than memory. Through the smoky interior of a cabin where a man bent over his work in the small hours, too absorbed to sleep. Through council fires and printing presses and the long terrible miles of the Trail of Tears. Through the silence of a grave that has never been found, and through the bright persistence of marks that have outlasted everything meant to erase them. Let all of that settle now. Let it find its level in you, the way water finds its level, not vanishing, but becoming still. You are breathing slowly. Notice that. The breath comes and it goes, and between the going and the coming there is a small pause, a moment of complete rest, and you have been breathing through that small pause your entire life without ever having to think about it. Your body knows how to do this. It has always known. 86 marks. That is all it takes to write any word in Cherokee. 86 shapes, each holding a syllable, each syllable a building block of something meaningful. The simplicity of that is beautiful, in the way that the most elegant solutions are always beautiful, not because they are simple in themselves, but because they fit the problem so exactly that the fit feels inevitable, the way a carved wooden joint fits, or a key turns in the lock it was made for. Sequoyah made a key. He spent 12 years making it, in the face of skepticism and loss and the burning of his work and the long patience required of someone who can see something no one else yet sees. And then he gave it away. He gave it to everyone who spoke Cherokee, anyone who ever would speak Cherokee, any child who would ever be born into that language and would want to hold it in visible form. That is an act of love. Not romantic love, not personal love, but the larger kind, the kind that extends beyond the self and beyond the present moment into the future, into the faces of people not yet born, into the hands of children who will never know the name of the one who made the gift and made it possible. Let your own body grow heavier now. Let the pillow take the full weight of your head. Let your shoulders drop, one breath at a time. There is nothing in this moment that requires your attention or your effort. The work of the day is done. Whatever you are carrying, you can set it down for these hours. It will be there when you need it. But for now, you don't need it. The mountains breathe in the dark. The old hemlock ridges hold the fog. The streams run cold over smooth stones in the valleys, making the sound they have always made, the sound they were making before anyone had a word for it, and after the words were made, and after the words were written, and after the writing outlasted the hands that held the pen. That sound continues. That sound is the sound of time moving gently through the world, not erasing but carrying. Not ending but continuing. You are safe. You are still. The talking leaves are quiet tonight. Sleep well. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.